Hey everyone, this is Amy Lubitow here in Portland, Oregon, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about a recent study I've done about men of color biking in Portland. I know that we were instructed to maybe try and get outside and do some more creative approaches to this video, but I just really couldn't think of any way to convey what is going on for folks who are men of color in Portland, except that I had this idea that maybe I could just walk around with like a computer or a phone and sort of show you that there's a huge difference, I think, in the way that I might be perceived in public spaces as a white woman, and that, cars, other cyclists, people would be giving me much more room and I think space. And so I think that some of the things that we found in this project are that really men of color are not necessarily given a lot of space by other cyclists, by other pedestrians. And so I think that I could have tried to get out there and do something like that, but I didn't. So I am going to just kind of be a little dry and give you some of the insights from this recent project. Some of you may remember me. I came out to see you all in Lancaster a few years ago. I presented at the Cycling in Society conference. Maybe it might have been 2017, and I was talking about sexual harassment and some racial profiling that people of color experience here in Portland. And so this project I'll talk about today is a follow-up on that study where we were specifically just going out and talking to men of color. I want to give a shout out. I have two different research assistants who worked on the project, Victor and Sasha, and I also have another faculty member who's worked on this project with me in our Black Studies department. The research aims were really pretty vague. We just wanted to talk to male cisgender bicyclists. In the United States right now, people are using the terminology BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, or other persons of color. So we've shifted and started to use that language. It seems to be inclusive and what people prefer. I know that that may be at odds with the way that you all talk about things over in Europe, but that's the way things are happening here in the US right now. I am very interested in mobility justice. A lot of the research I've been doing lately is trying to figure out how to theorize and to think about the notions of mobility justice. And so there is wonderful research that's been coming out lately in terms of how we think about justice and what that means when we're talking about our public spaces. And so I'm really hoping to kind of join in that conversation and be thinking about mobile geographies, critical geographies, feminist geographies. And so I think kind of inherent in all of these discussions about justice are really thinking about how we focus on different forms of oppression and how those different kinds of oppressions impact your mobility choices. So here in the United States, class oppression, gender, sexuality oppression, racial oppression, those things are all kind of where I'm really interested in trying to kind of move theorizing and move public policy forward and acknowledge that we need to attend to people's different capabilities and also acknowledge kind of historical oppressions that give people different access to opportunities. Portland, for those of you who aren't familiar, is over on the West Coast. Our population is rapidly growing, but it's about 640,000 people, but a much larger region if you include some of the suburbs. There is a lot of development and gentrification and a housing crisis that's been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. But we have historically had a reputation as a somewhat bike-friendly city, although that is not saying much in the United States when many cities have kind of lagged behind with bike infrastructure. But we do have a lot of different kind of unique and innovative approaches to bike lanes and bike thoroughfares. Here's just a picture, pre-pandemic, we did have a really high rate of bike commuting. We'll see how much that rebounds as people get back into offices maybe later this year. But again, we have historically had a pretty active bike culture. The project I'm talking about today is a semi-structured interview study conducted with bicyclists who ride at least once a week. The interview sample itself includes 25 cisgender men of color in Portland. The interviews were conducted in 2019 before the pandemic began. Those interviews were conducted in person, and then after COVID began, we switched to phone or Zoom interviews. I did about half of the interviews, and then my colleagues and research assistant who are men of color themselves did the other interviews. And so we did ask a lot of narrative questions. So just kind of trying to ask people, tell us about a time something good happened. Tell us about a time something negative happened. We recruited people in communal spaces, through social media, through snowball sampling, and through outreach to community organizations. So I had a relatively diverse sample, although about half of it was Black or African-American men. The findings that I want to share today, there's so many really interesting things. We're just getting started on writing a paper, maybe 2 papers, but I think that what the findings really convey is that public cycling spaces are not immune to the politics of our larger society. There's a racialized aspect, there's a gendered aspect to the way that those public cycling spaces are experienced. And there are many different ways in which people we spoke with experience various forms of pushback, oppression, kind of negative feedback for the fact that they were taking up some of that space. We've been talking about this as we've been analyzing the data as both heightened visibility. So because people of color are less expected to be bicyclists, especially here in Portland, pretty white city, there's a kind of heightened visibility. People notice them more, people respond to them more. They don't just blend into the scenery the same way a white bicyclist might. But there's also a sense of invisibility where people don't necessarily feel that they're seen in public policies. They don't feel that because of the nature of gentrification in Portland, a lot of people of color have been displaced to kind of further out, more suburban spaces where there is a real lack of cycling infrastructure. And there's also, we notice a real vulnerability to traffic accidents. So potentially cars not giving people ample space. I wanna set the stage for this by talking about what happened in 2020. There was a summer of 2020, as we were doing these interviews, there was a big group bike ride called the Black Liberation Bike Ride. As you can see here, it's supposed to be kind of a fun event. It was family friendly during the middle of the day. It had I think about 100 riders who participated. What we saw as respondents, many of the respondents in this study had participated in this bike ride. And what came to be alarming or interesting, I guess, from a research perspective about this ride was that during the ride, two different cars actually plowed through the really large group ride that was happening during the middle of the day. So not just once, but two different times, people kind of didn't acknowledge that this was a group of people of color taking up a public space, and there was kind of negative pushback. Nobody was seriously injured, but people's bikes were damaged and totaled. And it was really distressing and traumatic for a number of our participants. So I believe about 3 people we spoke to had actually participated in this ride and talked about what a big, how discouraging it was that that had happened, that cars did not respect their right to take up space to such an extent that they were going to respond in this way. This is a quote from Oscar, one of our Latinx participants. He's actually an active bicyclist and participates in many group rides. And so this is a really interesting quote because he's comparing a predominantly white bike ride that happens at night and the Black Liberation Bike Ride that was struck by cars. So he said, so this weekly bike ride that starts downtown, they usually do about 10 to 15 miles around the city, have about 25 to 50 riders, and in summer it can get a lot bigger. It's pretty cool. It was a great experience for me to get to know the city and feel like bikes belong in the street, but the rides are generally very, very, very white. The way the city and the drivers respond to them has been tremendously different than when I was part of the Black Liberation Ride. It was a different ride because it wasn't like a weekly meander around the city. But there were 2 instances when 2 people got hit. The Liberation Ride was in the middle of the day as opposed to the Thursday night ride, which is at night. And you'd think that would have been the one to be less safe. So here Oscar's reflecting on this kind of disparity about people respecting that public space. In addition to that, Black Liberation Bike Ride, I think is a really interesting case study for understanding that kind of combination of visibility and invisibility. We also had a number of participants reporting being verbally harassed. In some cases, like Liam here, if you read this quote, they're experiencing racial slurs. Some people experience the use of the N-word, which in the United States is very taboo. A lot of times the verbal harassment may not have been necessarily specifically racially motivated, but there was a lot of anger and resentment targeting folks. And I would say that this 35% of study participants who are verbally harassed, that would include a racial slur. Heightened visibility, obviously in the United States, policing is kind of always on our minds as we are thinking about talking about race and talking about mobility. And so certainly we had a lot of our participants talking about the fact that some of them said, I'm not that concerned about police. I feel safe. I know what I'm doing. But a lot of people said it's always in the back of my mind. I'm thinking about it. I'm constantly aware of it. So here we have Kevin who says, I do think about it. It's a thing that's in the back of my mind that I switch off. But I try not to dress so hood. I try to look appropriate on my bike. Like if I'm riding my fixed gear bike, I'll come in out my little fixed gear attire. If I'm riding my mountain bike, I try to look like a mountain biker. Like you're riding this $4,000 bike, you've got to look like a mountain biker. I was in downtown at the food carts and I had on a regular basketball shirt and basketball shorts and a shit ton of mud on me. So I'm waiting for my food and these 2 cops roll up. They're checking everyone out and they look at me and I look at them like, what's your problem? And they said, oh, you've got a really nice bike. Whose bike is that? like, this is my bike. Who else's bike would it be? And they were just like, we were just asking you a question. And I was like, do you not see me covered in mud? Who else's bike would it be? Go bother somebody else. So we got into an argument. So here Kevin's pointing out the fact that he may not always be thinking about the police every single time he rides. He does acknowledge that he has to think about what he wears before he leaves the house. He's got to acknowledge, or he acknowledges that he's constantly thinking about how police are going to specifically be responding to him and whether or not he's an appropriate bicyclist. Additionally, I'm always really interested in gentrification because I think it has significantly impacted the way people experience movement through the city. And because of gentrification really taking hold in Portland about a decade ago, there's just not as much like accessibility for people of color who've been displaced to places where rents are more affordable. The bicycling infrastructure just has not caught up in those further out parts of the city. And so because of that, I think that that's really created some dynamics that make cycling feel less accessible for people of color. So here Robert says he actually has continued to live in a historically Black neighborhood, but here in this quote, if you'll read it, he's really reflecting on the fact that he feels kind of out of place, that he feels invisible in the neighborhood that he's historically always lived in, that was once really a Black neighborhood, but that at this point, kind of white people come in and don't necessarily respect the space that he might be taking up or understand the way that he might be riding his bike in and around the neighborhood. Finally, I think one of the really alarming things that we realized during this process was that 20 of the participants were victims of a hit and run. So someone actually hit them with a car and then drove away without checking to see if they were okay. Here we have a reflection from Khalid, and he is talking about the fact that he avoided hit and run. So he jumped in, stopped the person from driving away, actually waited till police were able to come and force the driver to give him his insurance information so that he would be able to get compensation for his bicycle or for medical care. But again, 20% of our participants being victims of a hit and run is really alarming. There's only 25 people in this study, so 5 of them experienced this. I can bet you that I would not experience a hit and run or we would not have this rate of hit and run if we were talking to just white folks. So I think we have to look at that really high number of people experience physical danger and having the drivers not care enough to stop and talk to them as a form of invisibility. I think this also speaks to some really interesting research that's been done on pedestrians. In the United States, we have really high rates of pedestrian fatalities where people are not giving enough stopping distance in crosswalks. And again, the same kind of dynamics of gentrification where folks have been pushed to further out parts of cities into suburban spaces that maybe aren't designed for people to bike or to walk. And so they're in unsafe conditions and it's harder to see them, it's harder to respond with adequate time. So we're seeing that there's much higher rates of both pedestrian fatalities and bicycling fatalities in some of these semi-urban or suburban spaces. So I think this all ties into these larger notions of invisibility. Just a quick point that intersecting identities do matter. Here, I just kind of lumped everything together to give you a quick sense of what we are learning and finding, but we had all kinds of really fascinating identities that came up. The notions about rural spaces, about language, immigrant status, age, class, body size, disabilities, those were all things that impacted people's individual experiences. I just don't have time to get into them all today. So to make this not a totally depressing study, we did ask everyone, why do you bike? Like, what makes it fun for you? And I think it's, men of color bike for the same reasons everybody bikes, right? That they love it, they experience it. I love Kevin here. He says biking is just like flying without drugs. It's just beautiful. We had a lot of people talk about it being therapeutic. I think it's really specifically therapeutic for men of color who experience a lot of microaggressions and racism on a regular basis, and that there's something unique about the way people talked about bicycling that was very freeing. It was one of the few moments in a day where you could kind of just forget about everything that was going on and really, really focus. Sorry, I'm checking my time here. I got 30 seconds. So as we're thinking about some suggestions to improve cycling, mobility justice in Portland, we definitely think that shifting cultural attitudes, talking about racism, talking about historical oppression are essential. But we also know specific things like culturally specific bike shops that serve people of color, that speak in different languages, that those are essential. Infrastructure upgrades are super important, especially in some of those semi-urban or suburban spaces, but we also need to see some responses on the part of drivers. We're very concerned about the fact that drivers are not paying attention, that they're not understanding cyclist experiences, and that subtle forms of bias and racism are actually impacting safety on the road. Also, addressing gentrification and investing in bike support services are essential. Oops. This is protesting gentrification going back all the way to the 1960s. All right, so wrapping this up, in this project, we had our BIPOC cyclists experiencing challenges related to visibility and invisibility. I want to kind of continue to write about this project and to be thinking about mobility justice as an ongoing process. There's a lot of different struggles over how to adequately respond to historical oppression, how to adequately respond to things like gentrification and displacement. And so I think mobility justice scholarship really gives us that essential framework to be able to be thinking in that way. All right, thanks so much. If you made it this far, I really appreciate it. I'd love to answer questions if anybody's wanting to touch base or talk more about this. Thanks so much.